Mark Vanhoenacker is a pilot and writer, a regular contributor to the New York Times and a columnist for Slate. He has also written for Wired, the Financial Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Independent. Born in Massachusetts, he trained as a historian and worked as a management consultant before starting his flight training in Britain in 2001. His airline career began in 2003. He now flies the Boeing 747 from London to major cities around the world. And joining Mark in conversation tonight is Professor Robert Breedenthal from the University of Washington. So with that, please join me in welcoming Mark Vanhoenacker and Robert Breedenthal.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming. When the book was published in the UK first, and when I was coming over to the US to prepare for the US publication, my editors said, "Well, do you have any plans to be in Seattle? Can you make it to Seattle? Because people there read lots of books." And I said, and they make lots of airplanes as well. So it's a really great place to be. Is this working? Just go up? Oh, there we go. So I'm very grateful to the Museum of Flight and University Bookstore and Bob for making tonight possible. I thought I'd read just a few minutes from the beginning of the book, and then Bob's going to ask me some questions, and then you guys can fire away as well. So I've been asleep in a small windowless room, a room so dark it's as if I'm below the waterline of a ship. My head is near the wall. Through the wall comes the sound of steady rushing, the sense of numberless particles slipping past as water rounds a stone in a stream, but faster, more smoothly, as if the vessel parts its medium without touch. I'm alone in a blue sleeping bag and blue pajamas that I unwrapped on Christmas morning several years ago and many thousands of miles from here. There's a gentle swell to the room, a rhythm of rolling. The wall of the room is curved. It rises and bends up over the narrow bed. It's the hull of a 747. When someone I've just met at a dinner or a party learns that I'm a pilot, he or she often asks me about my work. These questions typically relate to a technical aspect of airplanes or to a view or noise encountered on a recent flight. Sometimes I'm asked where I fly and which of these cities I love best. 3 questions come up most often in language that hardly varies. Is flying something I've always wanted to do? Have I ever seen anything up there that I cannot explain? And do I remember my first flight? I like these questions. They seem to have arrived entirely intact from a time before flying became ordinary and routine. They suggest that even now, when many of us so regularly leave one place on the earth and cross the high blue to another, we're not nearly as accustomed to flying as we think. Flight, like any great love, is both a liberation and a return. Isaac Dinesen wrote in Out of Africa, "In the air you're taken into the full freedom of the 3 dimensions. After long ages of exile and dreams, the homesick heart throws itself into the arms of space." When aviation began, it was worth watching for its own sake. It was entertainment, as it still is for many children on their first encounters with it. Many of my friends who are pilots describe airplanes as the first thing they loved about the world. When I was a child, I used to assemble model airplanes and hang them in my bedroom under a ceiling scattered with glow-in-the-dark stars, until the day skies were hardly less busy than Heathrow's. And at night, the outlines of the dark jets crossed against the indoor constellations. I looked forward to each of my family's occasional airplane trips with an enthusiasm that rarely had much to do with wherever we were going. I spent most of my time at Disney World awaiting the moment we would board again in the magical vessel that had brought us there. At school, nearly all my science projects were variations on an aerial theme. I made a hot air balloon from paper and sanded wings of balsa wood that jumped excitedly in the slipstream from a hairdryer, as simply as if it were not air, but electricity that had been made to flow across them. The first phone call I ever received from someone other than a friend or a relative came when I was 13. My mom passed me the telephone with a smile, telling me that a vice president from Boeing had asked to speak with me. He'd received my letter requesting a videotape of a 747 in flight to show as part of a science project. He was happy to help. He wished only to know whether I wanted my 747 to fly in VHS or Betamax format. I'm the only pilot in my family, but all the same, I feel that imaginatively at least, airplanes and flying were never far from home. My father was completely enthralled by airplanes, the result of his front row seat on the portion of the Second World War that took place in the skies above his childhood home in West Flanders. Airplanes filled his old slides and notes. My mother, born into the quieter skies of rural Pennsylvania, worked as a speech therapist and had no particular interest in aviation. But I feel she was the one who best understood my attachment to the less tangible joys of flight. The old romance of all journeys, which she gave to my brother and me in the form of stories like Stuart Little and The Hobbit. But also a sense of what we see from above or far away. The gift, the destination, the flying makes not of a distant place, but of our home. My brother is not a pilot. His love isn't for airplanes, but for bicycles. His basement is full of bikes that are works in progress that he's designing and assembling from far-gathered parts for me or for a grateful friend. When it comes to his bike frames, he's as obsessed with lightness as any aeronautical engineer. He likes to make bikes and fix them even more than he likes to ride them. If I see him working on one of his two-wheel creations, or notice that he's reading about bikes on his computer while I'm sat next to him on the couch reading about airplanes, and they remember that the Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics, and that their skyfaring skills began with wheels, a heritage that suddenly becomes clear when you look again at their early airplanes. When I see pictures of such planes, I think, if I had to assemble anything that looked like this, I'd start by calling on the skills of my brother. Even though there was the time I got him in trouble with our parents for skipping his chores, and so he taped firecrackers to my model airplanes, and lit the fuses, and waited just the right number of seconds before throwing the model from an upstairs window in a long arc over the backyard.
So I thought I would ask you a few pilot-type questions and try to encourage the audience to also ask questions. What's the most beautiful thing you've seen in an airplane? In your book you mentioned the Northern Lights. Would that be at the top of the list or something more?
Yeah, the Northern Lights are certainly one of the most amazing things we see, and all of my flights begin around Heathrow, so it's just the nature of Great Circle routes that a flight, let's say, from Vancouver or Seattle to London in the winter, you're almost certainly going to see the Northern Lights, and we could be sat there for 2 or 3 hours, and one side of the sky is completely lit up with these curtains of changing illumination. It's really so special, and yet it becomes ordinary in the way that anything does when you see it all the time. And so trying to stay amazed at it is one of the challenges of the job, actually. So I think I'd go with the Northern Lights.
How about your scariest moment? Have you ever had a time in an airplane when something scared you, maybe in training, when you were first learning to fly?
There was, when I was doing my training, I was sponsored by the airline I worked for, now British Airways, and the course that we did was based in Oxford, in England, but north of Oxford. But for our visual flight training, they send us to somewhere where the weather is very good. In this case, we were sent to Phoenix, Arizona. And then for our instrument training, we'd go back to England, where the weather is absolutely perfect for, for instrument flying training, when you don't want to be able to see where you're going. An English winter is really perfect. So in Phoenix, I was doing my training, and we were doing visual flying, where we're navigating by looking out the window and by mapping what we can see onto either a memory or a navigation chart that we're looking at. And there was one time there when I was soloing, there's a whole bunch of airports in the Phoenix area. In addition to Sky Harbor, of course, there's many all around the valley. There was something we did call the Valley Rally, where you would just fly around and do touch and goes at all the airports. And it was a really fun day, a good way to get some practice in both the navigation and in landings. And there was one day I was flying where the weather became much hazier than forecast, and I had this phenomenon which many pilots will be familiar with, where you can actually see straight down, but you can't see horizontally very far at all. There's obviously mountains around Phoenix, and of course there's the airspace at Sky Harbor, which you want to steer clear of. And so there was a moment there where I was in the plane, and I was thinking, wow, it's this dawning kind of feeling of, I actually don't know where I am. And I was just about to call for assistance from an air traffic controller, but in fact our visual flight instructor had taught us how to use navigation beacons, even though they weren't part of the syllabus, and there was a beacon based at our airfield. So I dialed that up, and it steered me straight back to the airport. So that was the only moment where I've had that kind of pit in my stomach feeling. Once you're into the airline flying, obviously there's so much training based in the simulators, and the simulators obviously reproduce a whole range of situations which are much more dramatic than anything you'll ever encounter in the sky.
How about jet lag? It seems to me that a pilot's body really must suffer from those constant time shifts. I gathered from reading your book that you can accommodate those stresses maybe better than average, but I've heard that it can be so bad that it potentially can have adverse health effects. A friend told me about a study with lab rats where lab rats that were constantly being shuttled across the Atlantic had a significantly shorter lifespan. How do you cope with jet lag, and do you think that it's a serious thing or really not?
I was first wondering if those lab rats were unionized, if they had a professional association looking after them. The jet lag is obviously an important part of the job that we have to deal with. But in some ways, we don't actually experience jet lag in the way that a normal traveler would. So, for example, when if you went from London to Hong Kong, it's a 12-hour flight, 13-hour flight, maybe a 6 or maybe a 7 or 8 hour time change. And most people on the plane are going to stay there for a few days, and they're going to be doing things in Hong Kong which require them to be on local time in Hong Kong. Either they are going to meetings with people who are on a normal schedule in Hong Kong, or they want to go out and do tourist attractions and see the city. Whereas our work is done when we get there, and so you can really let your sleep go freestyle once you're there and decide what works best for you. So I do try to get onto local time a little bit, but a lot of my colleagues don't. They will stay on UK time, even in Hong Kong, and so or places that distance. So people will go to Hong Kong and they can spend 2 or 3 days there and never see the daylight because they're on a near reversal of their time, and that makes it easier when they go back to readjust to UK time. And so in that sense, the greater challenge is coping with the nights out of bed, the nights where you're not in the bed, rather than jet lag.
What's your ideal trip?
I think my favorite trip is probably going to Cape Town from London. It's a glorious destination. There's great food. There's great weather, and of course the route is really interesting. We take off from London. We fly over Paris and Barcelona and Algiers. When the passengers are going to bed, and we see the whole Sahara pass beneath us, and then the lights of the cities on the West African coast, like Lagos or Accra. And then we're over the open ocean, and then suddenly the sun comes up, and we're over the coast of Namibia. We can see the Skeleton Coast. We can see the great dunes of the Kalahari, and we're sitting up there having breakfast, having our eggs and bacon, looking out at a totally different part of the world. And then then we're making our approach into Cape Town and landing there. And when those longer trips tend to give us more time off as well, so we have time to enjoy the weather and the weather and the food and the beaches, and then it's time to go home.
We're sitting here in Seattle, and your current airplane is a 747. Mark, what's your favorite airplane?
It is the 747. It's a very easy question to answer. It's such a glorious airplane. When I was a kid, it was iconic to me, as it was to so many kids who wanted to be pilots. One of the pilots on my cadet course, she told me that the only reason she wanted to become a pilot was to fly the 747. It wasn't that she wanted to be a pilot. It was that she wanted to be a 747 pilot. And I wasn't quite that strongly devoted to it, but it is an amazing aircraft. I think it looks absolutely beautiful. I saw one from BA, not from BA, from another airline, I guess, coming over the city today, and it's hard to not look up. I'm surprised that not everybody's looking up at each time one of them flies over.
Favorite airport?
That's a tough one. I really like the airport in Vancouver. I don't know if that's fighting words to say in Seattle or not, but they've definitely taken on all that whole aesthetic of having water. So there's the fountains and there's aquariums and there's running water, and it's a very peaceful environment. There's a new international terminal in LA, at LAX, the Tom Bradley Terminal, which is beautiful. It has really lovely views. And my home airport, Heathrow, Terminal 5, is has just amazing walls of glass, and it's just really connects you with the air show that's going on all around you. But I guess I would say Vancouver's my favorite airport.
What's the biggest surprise that you experienced in your training when you were learning to fly, or even on the line now? What was the most surprising thing to you?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things, I came from quite an academic background. I had studied history, and so when I started my flight training, I hadn't had a direct background in engineering, either mechanical or any other kind of aeronautical, and yet we were suddenly dropped into this world that was in some ways the pinnacle of engineering excellence. One of our greatest achievements as a species. We're one of the, it's so safe and so reliable and so efficient, and so I was suddenly surrounded with what 100 years of human ingenuity has come up with. And I had quite a bias, perhaps, that there were creative fields and non-creative fields, and that the hard sciences or engineering were in the latter. And that was overturned within an hour of my first class, just encountering the kinds of brilliance that people had come up with over 100 years, and how much that mimics biological evolution. But of course, it's something that's been driven by hard work and a lot of just amazing achievements by engineers over the years. So that awareness of engineering as a deeply creative world was probably the biggest surprise to me, given my background.
If you could change things, what would be the biggest improvement you would make in the life of a professional airline pilot? Would it be, aside from more pay, maybe, better scheduling of trips, more comfortable seats? What would you change?
I wouldn't change the seats. The seats are they're sheepskin covered, at least on the 747. They're very nice, very comfortable for those 14-hour flights. One thing which I'd like to change, which will never be changed, I suppose, at this point, is it would be great if people could again come up to the cockpit during flight. I was that kid who was coming up into the cockpit, and asking to speak to the pilots and look out the windows, and that was one reason I wrote the book. Really, was to try to share with people what is so amazing about that job in flight, and it's and of course the reason that people may not know that now is because we're not allowed to have visitors in flight anymore. So if there was a way to change that, but I suspect that's not going to happen.
Biggest fear? Maybe you don't have any when it comes to flying.
Well,
Is it sleeping through a wake-up alarm? Is it?
And I suppose my biggest fear related to the job is simply, we get the medical checks every 6 months. We're given, our blood pressure is checked and our eyesight and all this. And, it's possible, of course, to lose your license and for a medical reason. And, that's obviously, it's something that people will have insurance for. But the idea that I would suddenly not be able to fly anymore would be a very sad thing for me. And that's one reason I think, when you go to a hotel, the hotel gym, most of the people in there are the pilots. There's a real culture of trying to stay fit in terms of our medical tests and trying to ensure we'll have a long career.
And suppose, and of course I hope this doesn't happen for 4 or 5 more decades, but suppose you were to lose your first class medical. Have you given any thought to what you would do if flying was, at least commercial flying was no longer available?
I might try to write another book. But
You're pretty good at it.
But I don't think that's necessarily the most financially secure way to think about one's future. I I really enjoyed the years I spent. I worked in a management consulting company in Boston, and most of our clients were multinational companies, and I found those challenges quite interesting. I think that the aviation industry itself is really amazing. I mean, it's an airline, as we speak of globalization as something that's happened in the last few decades or so, but airlines were globalized a long time ago, and the aviation industry in terms of when the plane lands in Lagos, the baggage bins have to fit, the jetway that attaches to the door has to fit. The way that airlines work on a global basis is really interesting. So maybe I would try to. There's lots of roles within airlines or within consulting companies that deal with this quite unique and remarkable business. So maybe I'd try to work in that field.
Well, I'm at the bottom of my list of questions. Maybe it's a good time to open it up to audience questions, so I don't monopolize things. Does anybody have a question?
I'm curious, you were trained as a historian. How did you make this leap into flying?
Well, I was obsessed with planes as a kid, but the idea of becoming a pilot seemed no more likely to me than becoming an astronaut. And I think a lot of that is that I didn't know any pilots. There were none in my neighborhood. I didn't have an aunt or uncle who were a pilot. I think if I had that kind of family connection or a good friend of my parents who was a pilot, it would have been an obvious route in earlier. But I didn't have that, so airplanes kind of remained just a hobby for me, an interest. And I started down a PhD in history. I quit that. I was sent to Nairobi in Kenya to do some research, and after I got there, I thought, the most exciting part of the trip has already happened for me. It was the flight here. And then I thought, I was in my late 20s at the time, I thought, I should probably give it a go. It's, you only live once. So I quit that program, and then I decided to work in a field that would allow me to travel a lot as a passenger, but also save some money for flight training. And then I got into that management consulting role. And then while I was there, I was applying for various training programs, and I got into the British Airways one on my second attempt.
How do you feel about gliders?
I've never been in a glider. When I look out at the 4 Rolls-Royce engines on a 747, I feel pretty good about them. But a lot of my pilot colleagues, in fact, one of my best friends from my training course is really into gliding, and he does it in his spare time and is always offering to take me up. So I should take him up on that offer once.
How many people are in the cockpit, and how much do personalities, what kind of factor does that play in your 14 hours?
Well, we have there are 2 pilots flying the plane, and then given the length of the flight, we might have a third or even a fourth pilot with us. And the personality thing is really there's a kind of amount of goodwill that people just bring to the job. We all know we love the job. We all know we passed our assessments, and we often when we meet somebody, we think we haven't met them before, but we're going across the world together, and there's a kind of excitement and a kind of love for the job just built into it, and people are very easygoing. There's a lot of humor in the job, about a good portion of it based on the movie Airplane, which probably comes up at least every other flight. So it's a very can-do, pragmatic, let's go have a nice day, work together attitude. And I didn't come through the military, but a lot of my colleagues did, and they say that that's something that they associate with their military training as well. And I can't comment on that. I haven't had that experience, but it's one of the best things about the job.
Do you have any favorite films in aviation? And if you were going to do a little personal film series, what would your picks be?
Well, I think the two sides of my personality are Airplane and Out of Africa, which has some lovely flying scenes in it. And the book Out of Africa, of course, has some great discussions of flying at a time when it was still pretty new. And I quote probably more than I should have from that in my own book. But yeah, so the first movie would probably be Airplane, and the last would be Out of Africa, and I never actually saw snakes on the plane, but
That's terrible.
but I flew with the captain once just after that came out, and I think one of the flight attendants was saying that she had just seen it, and the captain said to me, "Oh, you're not going to believe this, but I'm actually a trained wildlife handler." And I thought, oh yeah, whatever, sure. And then we were having dinner at some restaurant that night, and he took out these photos on his phone of him with lions and elephants on his last trip to South Africa. So he was the perfect guy to have on the flight if that ever comes up again.
On that subject, what that you know of, what is the worst thing a person has tried to smuggle onto one of your flights? A passenger, I would presume.
Gosh, I don't know. Well, I often try to take fresh fruit with me to have during the flight. Oranges, maybe an orange, apple, banana, just to snack on rather than, chocolate or nuts during the flight. And then, of course, we land somewhere where they've got those dogs out. So you have to remember to get rid of that food before you get off the plane. And then, of course, the dogs can still smell the banana long after it's been taken out of your bag. So and I don't really understand why that rule's in place. I mean, if you throw it away on the plane, it's just going to go to a landfill in the U.S., isn't it? It's going to go it's going to be disposed of in the country you landed in, isn't it? So I don't really understand those rules, but yeah. So I suppose my illicit fruit is probably the worst thing. We do sometimes have the kind of cargo we carry is often very interesting to me. When I flew the Airbus, we flew to Oslo a lot in Norway, and every time we flew back from Oslo, we had tons of salmon on board. I mean, tons and tons of it, and you could see where it was marked to go next. So it was going to Cape Town and Singapore and Mexico, and you get these insights into the economy that and how the world works. When we take off from San Francisco, we've got tons and tons of specialist medical equipment on board, and then like raspberries, like the fruit that's coming from the Central Valley in California. Often we have large quantities of banknotes on board, and we don't know what they're worth, but we know that what their weight is. So we have 300 or 400 kilograms of banknotes, and we often joke, where should we where should we go with these? So that world of cargo is often very interesting to me.
Can you talk for a minute about ice? I mean, you cover water in the article in the New York Times, but I don't know how much attention jet pilots have to pay to ice.
Well, ice, is obviously something that needs to be, or snow that needs to be removed before flight. I was on a walk around of an airplane at JFK with the journalist a few days ago, and it was very humid in New York. It was in the high 80s and very, very humid. And that plane had just come from London, and on the undersurface of the wing there was ice that had appeared. And it's because the plane spends so much time at very high altitude where it's very, very cold that the fuel cools down, and of course the plane lands with many tons of fuel in it, that it's carried in that high cold for 7 hours in this case or longer. And so that can actually cause ice to form on the lower surface of the wing, even in the most, even in sort of the last season in place you'd expect to find it.
Do you pay attention to ice in flight? Is that something you have to do?
So we have systems to detect and to remove ice from the plane in flight, and those are located on the engine nacelles and on the leading edges of the aircraft. And on the 747, the engines have an automatic ice detector, which activates and lets us know. On the Airbus I flew, it didn't have that feature, and so every time we flew into a cloud, we had to activate the engine anti-ice, and assuming it was the temperature was in the correct range. And it just became this kind of gesture where when you flew into a cloud, you hit two buttons, and you fly out, you turn them off again. It was a strange ritual so ice is obviously something that we're concerned with not flying with.
There's such a large population of people who are fully terrified of flying. You're clearly on the other end of the spectrum. I'm curious if you've encountered friends or family members who like have come to you, and what would be something reassuring from you, from someone who really loves flying, about people who just like can't even.
Well, I'm not the only BA pilot who's written a book. I think I'm maybe the fourth, and one of my predecessors is this captain whose name is Steve Allwright, and he's written a book about flying with confidence. And we always joke that he changed his name to Allwright when he was writing the book because what better what better name? You couldn't make it up almost. And he also has a video which runs on our in-flight entertainment, which we can point passengers to. And his big line about turbulence is that it's occasionally uncomfortable, but it's never dangerous. And that's the best thing to keep in mind. We often have visitors up before a flight who are nervous flyers, and they speak to the cabin crew and they come up and talk with us. And I think people are reassured by that. I speculate a little bit in the book, not too much about what it is that makes some people nervous about flying. And I think a lot of it has to do with, people often say it's not being in control. I often wonder if there isn't more that you can't see where you're going directly. You can't look straight ahead. That always strikes me as an interesting hypothesis. And maybe when passengers come up to the flight deck before takeoff, they get a sense of the kind of view that we have from the ground, and maybe that's something that people find reassuring.
I think the thing that I find kind of repugnant about flying now is that it feels like steerage. I mean, if you're not in front, you've got the best seat in the house, so no wonder you're going to be pro. But I mean, for passengers, it's terrible.
Well,
No, it's not.
It is.
Well, I wrote the, part. I know there's a lot of people out there who love flying, and I hope that some of them will like the book. But in a way, I'm almost more hoping that people who don't like flying so much will read it. And there's a lot of people who heard the journey is not the destination. Flying is how they get to where they're going for work, to do their business, to go to conferences. It's how they get to the new places they want to visit. It's how they get to the weddings that they want to attend. And flying is something they have to do and they don't want to do it. And for people in that situation, if you've got to do it, you might as well make the most of it. And thinking about the sort of original wonder of flight and just what an amazing thing it is to be up there at all is maybe a way to make those journeys, if not.
It's still relatively cheap.
Yeah,
As
yeah.
much as people might complain about costs.
Yeah, I mean, even if it doesn't turn people into the kind of person that I am about airplanes, maybe it makes the journeys a little better. And when I walk up to when I walk through Heathrow and I see the wings of a 747 I'm about to fly, and you kind of think, for how long? It looks like what it is, which is a dream come true. I mean, it was something that our species has been sort of imagining for as long as we can remember, and now it's imaginatively it's perhaps a victim of its own success.
That's a good way to put it.
Your book, there's a section about when you went through training to upgrade to the 747. And I think it was all done in simulators, and the first time you actually sat on the flight deck of the plane was your first commercial flight with passengers. What was that like?
Well, that's if I can back up a little, when I first did my Airbus training, we actually took an empty plane and went down to an empty airport in France, and with two trainers and me and my 6 friends sitting in the passenger cabin, and one of us after another went up and did our 6 or 8 landings, and that was an amazing experience, and that happened before we ever flew with passengers. Later, when I had a different kind of license, the simulators they have a rating called ZFT, they call it in the UK, of course, ZFT, which means zero flight time, which means the course is approved to allow you to fly without ever having flown the physical airplane, simply having flown the simulators. And that's a testament to, of course, how amazing the simulators are at reproducing the experience of flight. But of course, it is a remarkable thing to walk onto the actual airplane for the first time. And of course, the simulator has only the front few feet of the airplane, and flight tech with a whole bunch of computers sitting in the room next to you. And to actually walk onto a plane where you can see the blankets and pillows, and then you can start to see the passengers starting to board. It's an amazing feeling. And the first airliner I flew was the Airbus, but the flight I remember the most was that first flight on a 747 to Hong Kong, and it was just. Yeah, and of course we were quite busy in the cockpit, and on 747 you don't see many of the passengers because we're upstairs, and of course we're looking forward anyways. So I don't think I saw any of the passengers on that first flight, until the dispatcher, the person managing the flight on the ground, came up to us and said, "Everybody's on board." And I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, let's go." Yeah, it's just an amazing feeling, and of course, the 747 was the plane I dreamed of flying, so that first flight is really, really stuck in my memory.
On any of your flights, has there been a passenger that had to be removed or restrained?
No, I haven't had that situation. We do occasionally have people who become ill on the flight, and given the route network of the 747, we're often 2 or 3 hours from any hospital you want to go to. So so that presents some interesting challenges, and it's one of the aspects of the job that really makes the most of technology. I mean, we have a satellite phone which calls an office, I think in Phoenix, and they are a team of doctors. I don't even know if the doctors are there. They might be on call. They might be at home. But we talk to them and we describe the symptoms, and they can give us a whole variety of assessments. They can say that, obviously we have a lot of medical equipment on board. They can give us advice. They can ask us to find a doctor among the passengers, and doctors are very regular flyers. I've never been on a flight where we haven't had a doctor on board. Sometimes the first doctor you find is a doctor of anthropology or something, and you can say, "Oh, you can go back to sleep now." It's unless we have a much different situation later on, we won't be using your services. But there's always a medical doctor on board, and then of course those medical assessments which are done on the ground. One of the things they can do is tell us, actually, this person should really get to a hospital, and they can even then advise on which airports have the facilities which are most appropriate for the condition of the passenger.
Do you have the notion of what the next plane is for you? The 747 is getting old, isn't it?
Well, at some point in the next few years, I'll have to bid onto a new fleet. It's a really tough call. I think I'll probably go for the 787. But we've got a very large fleet of 777s, which, and of course, one of the things you're thinking about when you make that move is where are you going to go, what cities you're going to go to, and the larger the fleet, the more of a choice you have. So as the 787 fleet is still quite small, that's something to think about, maybe waiting for a little while. I think it's possible to have a dual-rated 777 and 787 fleet, which would obviously be amazing.
When you fly as a passenger, do you ever think about the pilot up front? I could be doing a better job, or oh, he made a mistake here, or she shouldn't have done that.
No, I never think that. I'm glad to be able to look out the window and listen to music, which is something they don't let us do in the cockpit.
What's the biggest blunder you've seen someone else make? Not you, of course, but biggest aviation blunder.
I can't say I've seen any blunders of that. Yeah, the only thing I've done myself, which I feel a bit dumb about, was on the Airbus once. I was making a PA to the passengers, an announcement to the passengers, and then when I came back from that, we got a call from air traffic, and I started answering the air traffic controller's call on the PA. But I think I only got about 1 or 2 words out, and then realized my mistake. That's obviously embarrassing, but.
Was a call from air traffic conveying some kind of information that could have been alarming to the passengers, just out of curiosity?
Say that again, please?
Was the message from air traffic control, was it about something that could have been alarming to the passengers?
No, it was just a change of frequencies. So So the British Airways call sign is Speedbird, so they were saying, I don't know, Speedbird 777 contact now, a new frequency, and I think I got the speed and about half the bird out over the PA before I realized I pressed the wrong button.
From our conversation earlier, I have the impression you live in New York, but your home field is Heathrow. So you've got to commute quite a ways even before you start to work. I would think that would be pretty tiring, but maybe not if you love flying as much as it sounds like you do.
Yeah, I tend to go over and then I'll do 2 or 3 trips in a row. Those trips might be back to New York. Many of the flights back between Heathrow and JFK are on the 747. So obviously I'm bidding for as many of those as I can get. And then I'll come back after all those are done, and then I'll have 10 days or 2 weeks off at home, which is a nice chunk of time. And occasionally they've had a pilot who's become sick in New York, and then they call me at home and say, "Hey, what are you up to, Mark?" and I head down to the airport, and we're always happy to help out, and that's one of the advantages of having crew scattered around the world.
For people getting into the industry or possibly into the industry, do you have any advice or any ideas about how that should be done nowadays, with it not being, not so many jobs?
Well, I'm at a slight disadvantage in giving that advice, and I didn't do my training in the U.S. And I know the market has changed a lot in the last 10 or 15 years since I was last looking at the U.S. versus Europe. So I'm assuming there are really good websites now that list the best avenues into the career, and maybe some books as well. But I could offer some advice in the UK, but it's in the US. I'm probably the worst person with my accent to ask about that.
My understanding is that young people starting out flying sometimes are not paid very much in the beginning as they're building time, and turbine time in particular, and waiting for a job to open up with one of the major airlines. But because you entered quite a while ago, I don't know what the market was like then, and the avenue that you entered, I think I recall from your book that the airline paid for that, or that was some program that they took care of.
They did. I ended up, even though I was saving some money, trying to save some money, I ended up on a program which was mostly sponsored by the airline. That program was stopped after 9/11. I started just before 9/11, but it's been restarted about 4 years ago. And the guy who's restarted it is actually one of the people who was with me on my course. He was so keen to make sure that opportunity remained available for young people in Europe, at least where BA is recruiting, that he set that program up. I think there are some programs like that in the U.S., but I don't believe they're sponsored in the same way. And clearly, it opens the profession to a lot of people who might not otherwise have a chance to get into it.
Doesn't Lufthansa have some kind of program like that? I seem to recall.
I believe they do. I mean, in Arizona, I think most of the people flying in Europe, in the skies of Arizona, are European or Middle Eastern pilots who are coming out for the training.
Have you switched from the pilots carrying their giant briefcases full of those maps and charts and everything to like an iPad for all that?
Yes, it's all on an iPad now.
And so I always wonder, the more you depend on computers, the more any failure would be more significant than if you were missing a page out of your book. So how do you feel about that?
Well, they've gone through a whole sort of regulatory assessment, and of course the plane effectively has its own map. I mean, it contains its own map as well, and then there's other resources like air traffic, and we actually have a backup manual, a set of backup manuals on board, but we don't use them. I've never opened them. The iPad is it's the way forward, I guess. Yeah.
Is there a mandatory age for retirement?
There is. It's 65 now. It was 55 when I joined, and it was raised. And of course, many people are happy to be able to work longer, and others are not.
Is that industry-wide?
is 65, or is that vary from airline to airline?
I think it varies by, first of all, by country, by regulatory rules. So in Europe, it would be under EASA, which is the new FAA, the sort of European FAA now. And then within that, the airlines will have their own agreements with their unions. Yeah, I don't meet many pilots who, I mean, you know, some people want to retire, but I've had quite a few emails from people who have read the book and are retired pilots, and they clearly have an enormous love for the job they had and wish they were still able to do it at least at this part-time. And I suspect I'll be the same way.
I have another question about the 747. Do they all feel alike, or can you detect subtle differences between the different?
That's a really good question. I was asked that by that same journalist I was walking around the plane with in New York a few days ago. They all feel the same. They feel it's obviously an important consideration when you're training that they all feel they all have the same feel to them. What does change, of course, a lot is the weight of the aircraft, depending on the length of flight and the amount of fuel and cargo that are on board. So if you're taking off from Singapore and the plane weighs 390 tons, versus when you take off from JFK to go to London and it weighs 290, that feels very different, and that's that's sort of one of the things we would talk about before a flight. Is how much the aircraft would weigh today, and of course at landing as well, the weight of the aircraft at landing changes depending on how much fuel is remaining, depending on the cargo. And so then that's something else we would talk about in our brief before we started the descent is, what's our landing weight today? And that's a question of how the plane, that is a question of how the plane feels, but in terms of how the different airplanes feel, there's no difference that I can detect. Maybe test pilots are able to pick those things up, but it's not something that I notice. Great. Thank you very much for coming, and I think I'm going to be signing some books and answering some questions if I can. So thank you very much.
Thank you both.